Welcome back to the panel discussion, a primer on identity and access management in government, sponsored by Okta on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today, Togai Andrews, the Chief Information Security Officer at FEMA, Brian Mulo, the Director of Infrastructure Modernization at GSA, Judy Snowich, the Identity, Credential, and Access Management Program Manager at the Interior Department, and Ted Gerard, the Vice President of Public Sector for Okta. Before break, we were talking a little bit about the OMB Memo and the impact it's had. We heard from our government panelists. Let's turn to Ted a little bit. Ted, from an industry perspective and from a, as you approach your government customers' perspective, what is the OMB Memo, what has it done for you around the update to identity policy?
Yeah, it's really a validation of kind of our core themes at Okta. There were a couple of neat things in the memo that, there were a bunch of things in the memo that are called out, but a couple that are interesting to us is, they tie it to the presidential management agenda, which is, hey, we're going to modernize. And typically that means cloud and SaaS and mobile and new stuff. It ties it to CDM, so there's a security component to it. Hey, we're going to do this. But the most important thing it calls out is identity as the new Nexus Point for security. They say, yeah, sure, perimeter security is important, but really the Nexus Point for that is identity, and we got to get that straight. And they call out cloud and SaaS and all that along with it. So that's what was super interesting to us, and really the reason Okta was founded in the first place. Do
you think in some ways it's the final nail in the coffin for defense in depth, for perimeter security, for let's build the biggest wall, put a moat around it, you know what I mean? Like the old...
I think defense in depth is still there. Right? Wow. It's not just you do this, right? You're going to do this and you're going to do everything else. Data centers aren't going away. PIV cards aren't going away. But there are certainly a number of we talked about PIV cards. We've got customers that have their customers that they don't want to issue PIV cards to, or they can't issue PIV cards to. A good example is the Navy's modernizing their HR, their My Navy portal. They need to be able to get to sailors and beneficiaries and what do they call them? Surrogates.
Yeah.
You can't give out all them PIV cards, but you have to have that same level of security. So they want to have single sign-on, they want to have multi-factor authentication, they want to be able to give the right person the right access to the right system from the right tool that they have. Whether that's an iPhone or an Android or iPad, they got to be able to deliver that in a secure and seamless fashion. So those are some examples, but yeah, defense in depth is not
it's going away. It's going to be for a while. Let's bring in the Chief Information Security Officer and talk about defense in depth. Togai, a little bit about that concept that identity really is a new nexus, or the next nexus for security. Talk a little bit about from your perspective as the CISO of FEMA.
So yeah, definitely as a CISO, that's one of the things that is very important to me is equating identity to security, because one of the things that really keep me up at night is really trying to figure out who's actually on my network and what's on my network. If I can be able to answer those two questions off the bat, I feel very confident and proud in my security posture. So definitely being able to equate identity to security is important. I think the memo really did a good job at highlighting that.
It's interesting you talk about who's on the network and what's on the network. You bring up, and I think Ted brought up the continuous diagnostics and mitigation, the CDM program, and that was one of the goals. And it actually fits in there. When I wrote my story about the memo, I had just seen someone from DHS, Kevin Cox, who's the program manager for CDM, talk, and he just laid it out in such a way. I was like, oh, like the light went off, right? Oh, this is what CDM is. This is how it makes identity so important. So just maybe go one more step further, Togai, about it's important, but how are you starting to use not just the memo, but how are you starting to ensure that you are authentication and verifying who's on your network and what's on your network, and how are you using identity to do that?
Yeah, good question. So currently at FEMA, we have done phase 1 of CDM, which is, and then we're working on implementing phase 2 also. So the key point for us when it comes to ICAM and security, and I see both as one, currently in FEMA, they both sits within the cybersecurity division. So knowing who's on your network as it relates to who's accessing your application or who's accessing your system, or what systems are on the network, and being able to identify those systems as authorized system is very important. And one of the ways we are doing that is through the regular PIV HSPD-12 card. But then that only works for your regular federal FEMA users. But yeah, but you have contractors, you have temp workers, you have surge employees. You also have other federal employees that comes on to FEMA's network as surge employees during an emergency or a disaster. How do you identify them when we all, as a federal government, doesn't really have an interoperable identity store?
Right, and I'm curious, this is Judy, I'm curious if you're treating them all the same today, so everyone gets a PIV, or do you currently have other solutions in place for them?
So derived credential, that's a great point. Derived credential is really playing a big part of this, and ensuring that we have an interoperable identity management system, so that someone from GSA with their HSPD-12 PIV card can come onto FEMA's network and doesn't necessarily have to go through the entire ICANN process anymore, but can use their HSPD-12 badge on our federated.
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge for us, and in the beginning, it was sort of the norm. Oh, we'll issue them a DOI PIV card, and we're like, no.
It's too expensive.
No, they are not, because the association isn't there. They're the FEMA employee or a GSA employee. They're not a DOI employee or contractor or resource. So we have moved forward with Federation and accepting and made it a policy now that to utilize, if they already have a PIV card, that's the card they're going to access our network with. We do still do some vetting, and are they allowed to get on our network? So we still do apply some of the same security rules to can they get on the network, but we no longer issue them our own PIV credential we use if they have one. Our challenge is when the people that don't have a PIV credential, so state, other government or non-government public entities that need access to some of our applications. And that's where I think the risk level and looking at what is required, what are they getting access to, and what's the risk level of giving them access, and does that require a PIV card or something at that security level? What's the next solution? That's a step down, and we're trying to find that now.
So I think what we really do at FEMA currently, especially for our state, local, and tribal and territorial partners, the state and local government want to have HSPD-12 card or PIV card. They do, but they have competing priorities, and PIV is not one of the mandates, right? So as FEMA move to a zero trust environment, one of the things that my team is working on is trying to work with our local partners to make PIV a priority, or HSPD-12 a priority for them, and help strengthen their ICANN program so that they can benefit from our zero trust environment.
I want to go back to something that I think Judy said and that Togai mentioned, and maybe bring Brian into this. Brian, you're responsible, if you will, for implementation side of this. So when someone says, hey, let's make security and identity the Nexus Point, how do you take that on from an implementation standpoint when you talk about the network? It's more than just, hey, I have a card, I'm ready to go.
Right. So from our perspective, we're realizing that the attack vector is no longer linear, so we need to protect from multiple angles. Identity proofing is a very important piece of that. I think understanding provenance of the user, where they're coming from, who they are, et cetera, are very important aspects of that as we move forward. But we realize that simply trusting a person's identity is not going far enough, right? We need to extend that to all aspects of their session. So understanding what token they're receiving, what kind of credential they're using, maybe potentially where they're coming from geographically, understanding the time of day and things like that, and profiling against normal usage are areas that we're attempting to get better at and improve and mature so that we can better recognize anomalies. And to the point of CDM, being able to use some of that data that's inherent in the CDM program to feed some of those analytics.
And I think the key here as well is not so much that you have, okay, I can get somebody on the network. It's what can they do on the network. And maybe Ted, talk a little bit about this idea of roles and responsibilities when it comes to identity management. I mean, really that's what we're talking about is I can let Ted Gerard on my network, but he can only read stuff. He can't write, he can't change, or I can give him read and write privileges, or I can only give them privileges in this small part of the network. I mean, all of that is part of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's super important. What Brian was essentially talking about was contextual-based access management. And if I got the right credential, and Ted always comes into the building and always logs into this machine at this time, and all of a sudden Ted comes from a different geolocation on a different machine at a different time zone, that should set off some kind of alarm.
Like China.
Comes in from China at 4 a.m. in the morning on a Samsung device, and he's a Mac user. You either have to deny the person or step up authentication on the person, or some kind of warning has to go someplace to do that. That's super important. But from Okta's perspective, it's once you have the platform and we have all the integrations, we can now control who has access to what per application. So if it may be okay for me to log into a system from a Starbucks, but I probably shouldn't be able to see these applications. So depending on my credential, if I come into the building, pass the guard with my PIV card, get in, plop it into my laptop, I should get full access to what my job entails, right? If I'm coming from a Starbucks, maybe I get to see a session of that. That's all possible and it should be done. So once you have all the people and all the technologies and the integrations done, your platform should just become the policy engine. And you should have a really solid way to be able to determine by group what you get to do, when you get to do it.
And Judy, is that something that Interior is starting to look at? Because as you said, we've decided that if Brian comes to visit you and has his HSPD12 PIV card, you can decide what kind of the session that he gets or the access that he gets. Are you guys starting to have that conversation? Because that's part of the governance side too.
It is, and we, it's sort of a little bit of a bumpy process.
It's a nice way to say it. Yeah.
Because we have to somehow authenticate or have that card, know that card is valid. So there's a check that has to happen when he puts the card into our network, that it's going to go up and look at the revocation list and make sure that card is in fact a valid card. So sometimes getting access to the right agency's revocation list is a challenge.
But I'm most excited that you guys are at least taking on reciprocity.
Oh, yes.
Because this has been such a problem. I mean, I've been to GSA several times, Brian, and they actually do allow, hey, you have a federal ID, go ahead, go through. Right. They may not be going through the gates, but at least they're recognizing that if Togai comes to visit you, his FEMA card is good enough. Where I try to get in, they're like, sir, to the side, please. Airport security, exactly. The other piece of this conversation that I want to tie in, and it came up a little bit, is cloud and IT modernization and this idea that identity and security, but it also has to be, and I think, Ted, you mentioned this, agile and flexible. So let me open it up to the panel. Where does this idea of identity management, ICAM, fit in with IT modernization within your agency? Are you having these conversations with your CIO and others? Togai, maybe?
Yeah. So right now, we had a previously started this conversation prior to the show. We're talking about, well, how do we move to the cloud and create the same sense of ICAM solution and an effective ICAM solution in the cloud? Especially when some of your customers have already moved to the cloud and you now, from a cybersecurity perspective or ICAM perspective, playing catch up. How do you do it? One of the biggest mistakes that I was afraid to make is, well, I do not want to replicate my current on-prem ICAM solution.
You just made Ted really happy.
So we didn't want to do that. But then the challenge is, well, what do we do then, right? So currently what we're doing, since we already have folks in the cloud, we're using the open authentication solution to bridge the gap between our on-prem ICAM and our cloud solution. Now, is that the end state? No, it's not, but I think it is currently a path forward to get us to modernize our ICAM.
And let me just take it one step further. When you have the conversations with your CIO and when you're brought into them to talk about, hey, we're going to modernize this application, or hey, we're going to move to the cloud with this set of apps, what do you think from a security perspective? Is identity part of that conversation? Is how are we going to ensure that we can authenticate and verify access?
Yes, identity is definitely part of the conversation. So I have a checklist of what what I try to get a good sense of feeling from when some of my customers are trying to move to the cloud. Identity, access management is also having a SOC capability or security capability also is one of the things on my list that I try to get a good answer to supporting the movement to the cloud.
Excellent. All right. We're going to take a quick break. Brian, hold the thought. And then we'll come back. We'll continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion, a primer on identity and access management in government, sponsored by Okta on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.